One of the most important fundamental rules of writing is that if a writer intends for a specific character to either come across as sympathetic or unsympathetic, they must actually come across that way to the audience. Or put another way, if the writer wants the audience to feel a certain way about the characters, they must make sure that they are written in a way to justify that feeling. And if you're a frequent watcher of my channel, you'll know that I've spoken about this at length in countless videos, since as a writer myself, I understand how important it is for the feelings of the audience and what the narrative wants them to feel to line up if the story is to be a good one. However, there are unfortunately way too many movies that get this simple concept wrong, a few of which I've gone over in other videos. But today I'd like to go over a particular movie where the writers screwed this up so badly that they wrote themselves into a no-win situation. And needless to say, there will be major spoilers for the movie in question ahead. So in case you've never seen it and don't want to know what happens, you should probably come back to this video another day. Okay. So to cut right to the chase, the movie in question here is the 1998 cult classic Deep Blue Sea, an intentionally campy send-up of sharks gone rogue and mutated monsters made in a lab flicks that nonetheless still takes its plot relatively seriously. This movie might just be one of the more famous guilty pleasure films out there. And considering it's not exactly great special effects and somewhat convoluted plot that even it seems aware is pretty stupid, it's hard for most not to view it through that lens. Heck, the director even said he cast Samuel L. Jackson in it just so he could famously kill him out of nowhere, so he clearly wasn't trying to win any awards with this. However, there is one legitimate problem with it that keeps it from being as quote-unquote good as it could have been. And that's in the characterization of Susan McAlester. Because as is widely well known, Susan was originally supposed to survive to the end of the movie, but test audiences found her totally unsympathetic because she went against protocols in the name of research, putting everything at risk and ultimately getting everybody killed. And the director himself actually agreed with them on this, so he removed several scenes in an attempt to make her less sympathetic and ultimately rewrote the ending so that she dies sacrificing herself and have LL Cool J's Preacher be the one to survive and save the day instead. And that's the version that was released to theaters. And as of the making of this video, the only version that's ever been syndicated. Only there was just one problem. Once the movie was released to the general public, some found Susan's character too sympathetic to die. And keep in mind that this was after the director had removed several scenes that would have put her in an even more sympathetic light. But in the end, even in the released version, when she's supposed to be unsympathetic, it's easy to see why some ended up sympathizing with her. I mean, she has a very tragic backstory for why she wants to cure Alzheimer's, is clearly not a bad person, and never intended for anybody to get hurt, even if she did cross ethical boundaries. But again, it's totally understandable why she did it. Is just as horrified as everybody else at all the carnage that ensues, and eventually owns up to the fact that she is partially responsible, has all of her valuable research destroyed, and in the end it comes to realize that they have to kill the sharks, which was the whole basis for her findings. To put it simply, this character is put through the ringer for her role in the shark's frenzy, to the point that many can feel she's more than suffered enough by the time it's over and didn't have to die on top of everything else, especially because she did everything she did in the name of a good cause, never had any malice intent behind her actions, and eventually accepts that the sharks must be destroyed. And what also doesn't help is that because there are so many people in the real world who have loved ones that suffer from Alzheimer's, it can make them sympathize with her on a much more personal level and want to see her succeed in curing it. I mean, this woman's research could have saved millions and prolonged their lives, and it's made clear that's why she wants to do it. Not for the fame, not for the fortune, but to prevent others from suffering through what she and her father suffered through. To put it simply, many would argue that in the theatrical cut, the punishment way outdoes the crime, especially because it's kept ambiguous as to whether or not mutating the sharks was actually her idea, or if she just went along with it. Now, whether or not you or I personally agree with that assessment of her doesn't matter, because the point is that there are many who do feel that way about it. So as a result, her characterization is basically any writer's worst nightmare, because some view her as too unsympathetic to live at the end, while others see her as too sympathetic to die. So as a result, no matter which ending they went with, there were always going to be people who wouldn't be happy with it. And as I said at the start, that's a catch-22 any writer should go out of their way to avoid, because it ends up leading to problems like this. Though, to be fair, there could be another, less talked about reason why test audiences were so adamant that they kill Susan's character. Because they wanted Preacher to survive instead. To put it simply, for test audiences, it might have been less about them viewing Susan in an unsympathetic light and wanting to see her die, and more about wanting to see Preacher live, so they wanted her to die in his stead. Because other than the controversy surrounding the ending and Samuel L. Jackson's death scene, Preacher is easily the most beloved and talked about aspect of it. And the writers obviously never expected LL Cool J to make such an impression on the audience and for him to completely steal the entire movie. And not to mention, characterization-wise, he is a lot more sympathetic than Susan. Not just because he's a blast to watch, but because his character is a completely innocent bystander who had nothing to do with the sharks getting so smart, and yet still manages to be one of the last survivors in spite of that. So from the perspective of test audiences, it's really no wonder that if they had to choose between if Susan or Preacher should live, they were going to pick Preacher hands down. He's a completely innocent show stealer. How could anybody not want to see him make it? But at the same time, given what's known about those test screenings, that might not have had very much to do with it, since by most accounts they almost unanimously hated Susan with a passion and wanted to see her die. Now again, Preacher making such an impression probably did have something to do with it, but it seems that the people at those screenings just felt that Susan deserved nothing less than death for what she had done, only for some in the general audience to disagree. And once again, any writing expert, which granted I am not, will tell you that it's very important to avoid characters who divide the audience so hard. I mean, it's not impossible to write a character like Susan and have it still work. I even did a whole video on how to write a movie with a bunch of unsympathetic characters, which you can find a link in the description to. But the thing is, The only times characters like that can really work is if the writer wants to start a discussion among the audience members as to how sympathetic she really was and what fate she really deserved, or if the narrative is completely devoid of morality entirely, which is another concept I got into in a separate video, which you can also find a link in the description too. And the problem is that it's abundantly clear that none of this was the case when making the movie. Susan is either meant to be sympathetic or unsympathetic, with no in between. So the fact that there's such a sharp divide between how people feel about her is on the writers, and something they should have been more aware of before they even started filming. They should have made sure she was sympathetic if that's what they wanted her to be. Because honestly, if it were me, I would have stuck more to the script. I mean, Susan was clearly meant to be a sympathetic character, and the fact that she still comes across that way to some people, even after having scenes that make that clearer removed, perfectly demonstrates that. So, as a writer myself, what I probably would have done was change the ending so that all three characters survive. Have Carter, Susan, and Preacher all live to the end of the film instead of trying to kill one of them off. Maybe I'd still have Susan get hurt, or even injured so badly that the movie ends without making it clear if she makes it or not. But if I were rewriting it, I wouldn't have killed her outright. And again, as a writer myself, I do believe at that point, that would have been the best way to end it, with all three of them surviving, rather than either Susan or Preacher having to die. Now, you don't have to agree with me on that. Again, I'm no writing expert. But as a man who's written books, I do honestly believe that would have been the best way to end the movie while avoiding the catch-22 of Susan's characterization, particularly if they did leave her fate ambiguous. That way it would be up to the individual audience member to decide if she deserved to live or die and could abide by their own interpretation of what happened to her after the movie ends. But either way, the point here is that the characterization of Susan McAlester in Deep Blue Sea is probably the textbook example of everything a writer should avoid when writing characters. Because as I just spent the whole video going over, on the one hand, some people find her too unsympathetic to live, while on the other, many find her too sympathetic to die. And because the movie doesn't have the rare type of narrative where this can work, the writers had very few options for an ending that would have left most of the audience satisfied. And as a result, the movie is arguably more talked about because of its ending, rather than because it was the fun time everybody involved intended it to be. And what's even more remarkable is that all of this could have been even worse if the movie hadn't taken the approach it did. I mean, if Susan's characterization had applied to a movie that was trying to be conventionally good, it could have easily ruined the entire thing. But because it was never meant to be taken 100% seriously, it just became a controversial aspect to it. But still a rather large blemish on what many would otherwise see as a typical guilty pleasure movie. Alright, I think I've gone on about this for long enough. So now I'd like to hear what you guys think. Do you believe that Susan McAlester from Deep Blue Sea was an unsympathetic character, or not? What do you think her fate should have been? And perhaps most importantly, do you think her characterization and the major controversy it caused perfectly demonstrates why it's so important for a writer to make sure the audience's sympathy always lies where they want them to? Or do you believe that there are better examples of that out there? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And as I've already said multiple times throughout the video, you don't have to agree with any opinions expressed if you don't want to. Everybody is entitled to their own opinion, and if you think that my entire grasp of the situation was completely wrong, that is absolutely fine. And thank you all for watching. It is greatly appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.